But can Australia meet its target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without including nuclear power in the mix? The head of the federal government's nuclear research organisation says not a chance. According to Ziggy Switkowski, nuclear energy is inevitable because it offers the only real alternative to fossil fuels for large-scale power production. It's a view shared by a growing number of uranium explorers in WA, who are hoping for a change of heart or a change of government to allow them to mine the state's vast deposits. As Claire Moody reports, they're also banking on a shift in attitudes towards nuclear once the cost of the emissions trading scheme hits home.
In the midst of WA's gas crisis and growing concern about climate change, that political taboo, nuclear power, has been creeping back into the headlines.
It's also time to start talking seriously about nuclear.
Nuclear is our only option.
No nuclear power, no nuclear waste, no uranium mining in Western Australia while I'm the Prime.
But the Premier's resolve hasn't deterred a plethora of optimistic explorers who are preparing for the post-Carpenter era.
23 drill holes into that anomaly, a total of 170 metres depth.
This Netherlands-based company was recently granted licences to explore in the Kimberley and Meekatharra regions. It believes uranium mining and nuclear power stations are inevitable in WA within 20 years.
I see one built and located in the north to power the industry in the Pilbara, and I see one closer to Perth, between Geraldton and Perth, say on the coast.
To back up his vision, Ross Brown cites the example of France, where 59 reactors provide 78% of the country's energy needs.
If you look at the French example of 1 million people per power station, with our population of Western Australia, we'd only need 1 or 2 nuclear power stations.
The view that nuclear energy is on the cusp of a worldwide revival, supported by the head of the federal government's nuclear research organisation.
Australia finds itself in a rather small and exclusive group, because there are now 31 countries that are nuclear powered and approximately another 20 that will introduce nuclear power between now and 2020.
Yes, there are huge challenges confronting Australia.
The trends prompted a controversial call for the Labour Party to rethink its opposition to nuclear.
What I'm arguing for is not necessarily a whole nuclear solution, but at least putting it on the table and having a sensible, bipartisan and calm and rational debate about these issues.
But while federal Labour endorses uranium mining for export, the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, doesn't believe Australia itself needs nuclear to respond to the climate change challenge.
All those in favour, please raise their hand.
Dr Switkowski disagrees.
The only alternative to the use of fossil fuel for large-scale production of electricity remains nuclear power, and there are many countries now that have reached that conclusion. My own expectation is that Australia will also land at that particular point. It just takes a bit of time to get both the community and our political leaders to agree with that.
But building nuclear power stations is not something Australians will ever be ready for, according to WA Green Senator Scott Ludlam, who took up his new Senate position this week.
Right back through the last 10 years of the Howard government, polls have consistently shown that the vast majority of people wanted us to sign Kyoto and wanted us to support renewable energy technologies, not nuclear and not clean coal.
The Senator compiled this recent documentary amid concerns that the threat of climate change could lead to the beginning of nuclear acceptance in Australia. Focusing on the baggage of proliferation, safety and radioactive waste, he also says the claims of a nuclear renaissance overseas are nonsense. He says the opposite is true.
This plant in Oregon cost more to decommission than to build.
Wind energy is being installed at a rate 10 times as fast as nuclear power at the moment. So the nuclear power industry is stalled around the world, and there's barely any construction going on whatsoever, while renewables are going through the roof. So with a little bit of support from the federal government and from the state government, we could have a renewably powered Western Australia within 20 years.
While it doesn't look like Australia will be heading down the nuclear path anytime soon, many in the uranium industry believe public sentiment will change once the costs of emissions trading are passed on in the form of higher electricity bills.
Uranium explorers like Subiaco-based company Paladin, which has had its assets in WA on hold for the past decade, says the Carpenter government shouldn't be dismissing nuclear power.
They're totally underprepared in terms of future energy options, that even at a standstill they can't achieve their emission targets, never mind the growth that is necessary in power generation. And to accommodate that is virtually a dog chasing its tail.
When you actually look at the numbers, they could only afford to build nuclear power stations in Australia with huge support from the taxpayer. When we've got renewable energy industry going absolutely crazy overseas, I just don't think there's any need for us to revisit the nuclear question yet again.
In the meantime, the uranium industry continues to lobby the WA government to lift the ban on mining so it can tap into some of the predicted growing demand from overseas.
For people to say that we don't need the uranium is, I believe, is rather arrogant, because it makes decisions for other peoples of the world and who don't have the luxuries that we have.
But the environmental credentials of uranium aren't being accepted by the Greens, who claim nuclear represents a 20th century dead end.
We find that in time, nuclear plants will generate as much greenhouse pollution as gas-fired power stations.
They're lobbying hard for tough emissions trading, but a response that doesn't include nuclear.
I would very much like to see uranium mining phased out. We certainly can't be starting it up in Western Australia. We can't just keep feeding this industry, which is essentially so closely tied to weapons of mass destruction.
Claire Moody reporting.